Welcome back. Today, Anya and I are very excited to welcome back author, comedian, and broadcaster Robin Ince to the podcast. When we first had him on, Robin was in the middle of writing his book, which has now been released, and that is Normally Weird and Weirdly Normal, My Adventures in Neurodiversity. And this is a book Robin wrote about his experiences getting a diagnosis of ADHD, what that means for him, how it was helpful. So today we have a conversation all about ADHD. Robin tells us why it was helpful to understand himself with this diagnosis, but also why Robin did not actually enjoy the formal diagnostic process, which is interesting. We discuss some of the controversy around the ADHD diagnosis that takes place in the public discourse, some of the flaws and limitations of the ADHD diagnosis from a more clinical, scientific perspective, and how psychiatry could potentially move towards a more pragmatic, problems-based approach. Before we get into today's conversation, I just wanted to mention I was really pleased to be invited to speak at the London Business School TEDx conference this week. There were a lot of really interesting talks like Sarah Delagarde, the first woman in the world to summit Mount Kilimanjaro with 2 prosthetic limbs. Professor Tim Minshall was there. He's the professor of innovation at Cambridge, and he was speaking about his new book, Your Life is Manufactured. And I also got to see Professor Adam Zeman, a neurologist who talked about his book, The Shape of Things Unseen, a New Science of Imagination. I got to do my talk about intuition and decision-making and whether or not people should follow their gut instinct. All of these talks are going to be out on YouTube later this year, so I will let you guys know when it's out. If you're interested, I would definitely recommend going to the TEDx conference at London Business School next year. And I personally would like to give a huge thank you to the team there for inviting me and for all the support they gave me in helping me to put my talk together. This is The Thinking Mind, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, therapy, self-development, and related topics. As always, thank you very much for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Robin Ince. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to see you again. Was it 2 years ago we did, or even longer?
It was a year and a half ago, I think.
Whatever book I'd written when I saw you then, nearly everything got thrown away again in about January of this year. And then I started all over again.
Writing is brutal. I should say I'm with my co-host, Dr. Anya Borisova, as well. And we're delighted to have some time to speak to you about your book today.
Brilliant. I'm looking forward to it.
Tell us a little bit about what initially motivated you to write the book. How did it come about?
Well, originally I was going to write a book called Anxiety for Everyone. Because I went through, after I wrote a book, When I'm a Joke and So Are You, one of the therapists I interviewed, Josh Cohn, said, I think you should go into therapy. And so I tried it for a little bit. Very good therapist as well. Her name is Juliet. The thing that I realized was that an enormous number of different issues were all the same. They were all anxiety. So what I'd been seeing as there was this one big ball of stuff, whether it was physical complaints, whether it was kind of neuroses, whether it was, sometimes depressive thoughts, all of that kind of stuff. So I started writing that, and then I realized I didn't think it was just that. And I was very, very lucky because a young man got in contact with me when I followed him on Twitter, and he just said, can we have a talk about neurodivergence? And he was the person who basically explained why he thought I was ADHD. And it's interesting to me because, like many people, I was definitely avoiding it because I had lots of friends with ADHD. I thought, how come everyone's got ADHD nowadays? And I think that's a very typical thing, which is that you kind of you think, but isn't this just being human? And I don't think you can sometimes realize the exhaustion when you don't really understand your mind. And with that lack of understanding comes a lot of, great big weight of other, but what I was talking about today with someone actually, but what I would call, the perpetually negative inner voice, that constant negative inner voice. So I was very lucky, because if Jamie and Lion hadn't got in contact with me, then we wouldn't be doing this podcast. We wouldn't have done the previous podcast. I would have, because I can't remember if we talked about it before. One of my favorite, I think it's Sarah Hendricks, who's an expert on autism, and she, I think, had written 3 or 4 books on autism before she decided she'd write a book about what it was like for her as a neurotypical woman to live with an autistic man. And it was only when she announced that everyone went, "Oh, we thought you knew, Sarah. You're not neurotypical." And she's very interesting, I think, in again showing how we can, with no judgment on other people, very much accept other people's, neurodivergence, mental health, whatever it might be, but we can often set a totally different set of parameters for ourselves. So that's basically how it happened. And then because of that, I, in particular, knew I'd already, since writing I'm a Joke and So Are You, I'd met so many people who were going through their life unhappily. And were masking it. And because I think by writing that in particular, and because I'm normally out and about after a gig, people can always talk to me. I'm always accessible generally. I was hearing so many stories of how unhappy so many people were, but they were surviving. And as you know, in our society, there is this problem which basically says, look, if you're not getting in the way of the system itself, then just shut up. Whereas, which very much puts, so it's great for neoliberalism, capitalism, all that kind of thing. But it means that people are just getting on with their life, trying not to create any friction, but living deeply unhappy lives. And I really do because of the enormous transformation for me, I wanted to at least write something that had very open arms for people, and write something that was very much about the story of our lived lives, not something that was, heavily scientific, or saying this is, just looking at why this might happen, but looking at it as in, an actual experience. I wanted to make sure it was a book of stories.
And it's very common for people to feel their experience of getting a diagnosis like ADHD or autism seems to be transformative in some way. You use the word transformation. What was the transformation for you?
Well, it's a huge like today. We're recording this on Good Friday, which is also would be my father's 95th birthday, and it's the 2nd anniversary of his funeral as well. The funeral where I showed his signed copy of Penthouse magazine, possibly the first time vintage erotica has been used in the pulpit, and I went for the one of the walks that I would regularly do with my dad. And I still do that walk a great deal. And I felt totally within that world in terms of looking at the bluebells, in terms of, I have to stop all the time when I'm walking. I walk very far, but I just go, that's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. I love that. I love that. I love that. I love that. It's like being in a very benevolent manic state. Whereas before, the antagonistic negative voice meant that I would very often, I'd be trying to look at things, but I was blinded by the negative voice. And so that's the first thing in terms of being there now, in terms of being just right. This is me. The disparity between who I appear to be and who I am is very, very thin now.
Right.
And I think to have that, and we may well have talked about that before, but I do think, one of the biggest problems is the greater the disparity between who you appear to be and who you believe you are on the inside, the greater your unhappiness. And of course, our society places many pressures on people and many fears, and people hide things. And the more that we hide, the more it damages us. And I feel that there is very little hidden. And with my friends as well, people like Josie Long, who's also diagnosed ADHD, my friend Joe Turbot, who we always had a huge amount of energy in each other's company, but now we don't have the negative. We might still go through periods of darker thoughts and things like that, but it's even easier for all of us to carry each other and hold each other up. And I think things like that. So I also would just like to footnote that I'm also very aware that my transformation is far easier than many other people might have, partly because of what I do for a living. I have predominantly control over what I do. I say that, obviously, that's a weird thing to say with ADHD. So I say I predominantly have control, but I don't mean that I in any way know what the next sentence is going to be. But what I mean is that I can choose a lot of my work. And I realize that a lot of other people are in far more restrictive environments. And of course, also, I'm a white guy and a middle-aged white guy who, that all of these things carry with them a huge amount of advantage. So for me, I was able to really, I think, and I'm not on minimum wage. Things like that do make a huge difference.
I think it's really interesting. So you're talking a lot about self-acceptance. So there's less of a disparity between who you think you should be and who you are. I think I'm a huge advocate of self-acceptance. And if I could pose a question more kind of from a devil's advocate perspective, obviously for the listeners' benefit, I do assess people for ADHD. I do, when I feel it's appropriate, diagnose ADHD. But just for the sake of argument, does one need a diagnosis in order to accept themselves? Could you have not gained more self-acceptance without something like a formal diagnosis?
Well, of course, I didn't have a formal diagnosis. I had a diagnosis by someone who really knew what they were talking about, by someone who had lived their life as an autistic individual. And I think that helped a great deal. For some reason, no, for me, but I don't think that's true of everyone. I mean, I really think in the same way that the mind is so different, as we know that when we place chemicals in the mind, the huge difference we might find when we take anti-anxiety, antidepressants, whatever. So I don't think there's a one way fix it. But I mean, in my own mind, I think especially with ADHD, if you have a broader corridor for us to pass through as human beings, and we didn't have such a kind of restrictive rule-based society, then there's a lot of issues which wouldn't be issues. The whole kind of like 9 to 5, I need this done by this time and this done by, so many of these are disabling for people who can actually deliver a huge amount, often very much more than what, and I don't really even like the term neurotypical, but you know what I mean when I'm saying that the possibilities very often of neurodivergent people are incredibly expansive, and then hugely, like I was doing an event where it was an event for, I can't remember what I think science business is, and this guy came up to me afterwards. He went, "Oh, I've heard you're ADHD." He said, "We got a guy who works for us. He's ADHD. He's very, very good. But I mean, the one trouble is he just never seems to be able to make the morning meeting." I said, "How important is it that he's at the morning meeting?" He said, "Well, it's just a thing where we all," I said, it sounds like what he's bringing is a lot, but he may not be able to tick all of the boxes, which are really the kind of the rather bland elements that we go, but you need to be in at 9 o'clock and you need to leave it, all of that stuff. And I think if we had a more malleable, I mean, it's a bit like looking at, for instance, since lockdown, there's been a lot of research, and from beforehand as well, to say that working from home can be actually often better than working in an office space. And yet that suspicious mind of institutions is, no, we need you back here. We need to be watching you all of the time. And I think all of these limits are, are hugely problematic. So hang on, I'm answering a different question now, aren't I? You were asking about diagnosis, weren't you?
Well, I'm curious. Did you? So as of yet, have you had a formal diagnosis?
Yeah, I did, and I didn't enjoy it at all, but I did get it.
I'd love to hear about what that process was like.
I just didn't. Do you know what? I knew I didn't need it, and I also knew why I was having it done. I knew that I was having it done because it was specifically for this book, because I thought, there's so much cynicism, as we know, in anything which is considered to be other, that people would go, well, I find it very interesting because actually, he's not had a formal diagnosis. It was just this autistic guy who told him. And of course, I've been diagnosed by people for 20 years as a performer. But, audience members of neurodivergent audience members have been coming up to me on a nightly basis, seeing within me what I was avoiding, or not avoiding, I don't really know what the word is. So yeah, I didn't really enjoy the process. So I did it for a very pragmatic reason. And, again, whatever, and there have been cynical people, I think it's very interesting that one of the things that happens for those of us who get this, and I will always avoid that, people go, why do you want a label? And you go, it's not a label, it's an instruction manual. It's a roadmap. It is not a label. A label is just as simple as you stick it on your cardigan and say, I am this. As we know, whether we're talking dyspraxia, whether we're talking dyslexia, like a friend of mine who was dyslexic and he was only diagnosed after he left school. But the moment he found out he was dyslexic, he has gone on to live the most amazing life as an autodidact, working in prisons, creating wonderful pieces of art. He was given a freedom, not just because he had that label, but because he had that understanding. So I just want to throw that in there as well. I think it's a very important thing not to. The label is very much, I think, a word used by the cynical to discourage people. Go, why do you want that particular badge? I don't want a badge. I want, and it's all. I always find it funny, the idea that you have an instruction manual for ADHD in your head, when of course, as someone with ADHD, you're very bad at reading instruction manuals, but instinctually, it kind of, it works. But I think, I think a lot of it is down to battling with that, with the cynicism that's out there, and I definitely found that people, oddly enough, one of the, or perhaps not odd at all, one of the institutions that I work for, I suddenly had this thing where there was I had a meeting with my agent, said 2 of the executives believe you're having a mental health episode. In fact, I'd never been mentally healthier. And that's one of the things that I'm sure some listeners may have experienced themselves or with friends, which is when you lose the incredible self-loathing that can go with neurodivergence, you are not as easy to bully. You are not as easy to boss around. I don't think it's any coincidence that it was after that finally, after years, my friendship with Ricky Gervais fell apart, because I had the confidence, before, apart from anything else, to write in a very gentle way that I worried a great deal about the way he dehumanized trans people. And I think I had a new confidence in going, no, this is not acceptable. And I see that in a lot of things now, that I feel I can stand up, and that is where people can go, oh, I think you must be ill, because we can't bully you as much as we used to.
I'm curious about Anya's perspective on this, because one thing that it's worth, I think, listeners knowing is that ADHD is, strangely enough, quite siloed within mental health and autism to an extent. It's kind of, when you train in general psychiatry, you tend to become very, very familiar with most of the most common conditions. But then strangely, ADHD and autism very much remain specialties within themselves. I had to do separate ADHD training after I became a consultant psychiatrist. How do you see ADHD within the broader landscape of different mental health conditions, Anya?
I think it is tricky, especially as a trainee, and especially, it's something that we talk about in our trainee groups, the fact that there's this area which we seem to have oddly little training, teaching and experience in, unless you specifically seek it out. But it doesn't fall into the general training, at least that we get at the centres where I've worked, where Alex and I trained. And so it means that you feel like, I think at the moment you're kind of playing catch up a little bit, so that there is this thing that medical school didn't really cover, and then later training hasn't really covered. And yet it's super common. It's really important. It can be quite defining to people's lives. I guess one of the helpful things that I think I heard from someone you'd spoken to on the podcast, Alex, is that, it's not a condition in the way that we see depressive episodes that come and go, for instance, but it is sort of the way that other people's brains are. It's a slightly different way of living in the world. It's a whole part of that person's existence. It feels like an area that we need to understand better, especially because of the nuance involved, especially because it can be so important to people to have a diagnosis, but it can equally be so important to make the correct diagnosis in a world where we don't have blood tests or brain scans that tell us if that is the right diagnosis, because it's the right thing for some people. If it's not the right thing for someone else, then you're missing something different.
I was just thinking about, again, the limit of definitions, because thinking about there seems to be an increasing amount of research where we see, and Gina Rippon, I know, has got a book coming out about the amount of late diagnosis, very late diagnosis of autistic women, that, even the idea of women being autistic, it seems pretty recent. And I meet, doing events, a lot of women who 50s, 60s, 70s, who, some who in their late 60s have been diagnosed, and they've lived their whole life and done, with that. And and it seems to me with ADHD as well, which is, in fact, when I was doing the book, one thing that I realized, I think my ADHD was far similar to a lot of the women that I spoke to than the men. Because as a very anxious child, I was keeping in all of my, I was fidgeting in small ways, and I was chewing paper, and I was scribbling on things all the time, but I wasn't the one who was climbing over the desks. And that seems to me, again, to be an example of mental health is an issue if someone's getting in the way of the formula of society. But if it's not, and many of those autistic women and also ADHD, they're not getting in the way because they're hiding it all. And I just wondered, again, because so much of it's been masked for so long, and now everyone's going, God, why is everyone like this now? And it's like, well, we've reached a stage where people are now prepared and encouraged in some areas, and feel that they've got some permission to say, this is actually what my life has been like on the inside.
Right, the right to open up about their struggles.
I think the thing that sticks to my mind and links to, I think, what you were talking about before, Robin, is the amount of energy that it is taken up. So sort of the people that I have met who have got a diagnosis and sort of the explanation of their life in later life, that's one of the things that they point to, that they, how much energy it took up to mask, and the fact that having the diagnosis sort of gave them the choice to, that they can still mask if they feel like it's necessary in a certain situation, but the understanding and the ability to just not, because they realize that this is something that they don't have to hide or act differently or fit in with people's expectations, just kind of frees up so much mental energy. And I wonder if that links to what you were saying about sort of suddenly feeling better and having time to deal with issues that you didn't before, couldn't kind of face dealing with.
Oh, yeah. I mean, totally. I think on many different, I wrote a piece for The Big Issue. I think it was The Big Issue the other week about saying that I write a lot of poetry now, started just under a year ago. And I've write hundreds I've written about 1,000 poems in the last year of varying quality, obviously. And they all come instantaneously. And I think it's in the box which used to keep my anxiety. So all of that energy where the anxiety was and leaking out, to have that, it doesn't take, I mean, I would say to anyone who ever gets worried, they go, but what if I get diagnosed? Do I lose something? I think in terms of, say, creatively, I don't think that is true. I think I can see why people are wary, why they go, oh, but I've got this bit of pain, and this bit of pain might be my creativity. I think actually by losing that pain, what you get, as you said, is a huge amount of energy, is a huge amount of extra. There was a thing that I used as a kind of, metaphor, and I've heard other people use it since, which is, it felt like I had this incredibly heavy coat on, which was made of horsehair, and it was damp, but it didn't feel like that when I was wearing it. But when it came off, it was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. This is, and I've always been someone who says yes to far too many things. So I don't think anyone would have thought that the energy was, that I didn't have energy. And yet that what I would say is that was filled with a negative energy. Whereas now the creativity is filled with a kind of positive energy that is there. And the instantaneous way that I would find jeopardy or threat is now replaced by an instantaneous way of going, that's an interesting shape of moss. I think I might write about the shape of the moss on that wall. So again, I know I've been very lucky in that in that way, but I think it is, you're right, the amount of energy that is taken up is remarkable. And it is, because I remember the first time that I still think about it a lot. I don't forget about it. I think it's very important to think, what am I doing today? Having little moments where I think this would not have been my life 3.5 years ago. And so keeping that, I never, ever just take it for granted, after 50 years or whatever it will be. I don't know when it probably started, when I was about, I don't know. The first things I can really remember are things like suicidal ideation when I was 7 or 8 years old. And, and from that point onwards, that is sapping away and taking it. And then to be 52 and go, oh my God, this is, to feel the weight of that coat leaving is incredible.
So definitely it sounds like the self-acceptance piece has been really useful. And when I assess people, if I diagnose them with ADHD, sometimes that's enough. Like, okay, I have this understanding. I can understand how these seemingly disconnected problems actually connect under one umbrella, under one phenomenon. For many people, that's enough. They might try a few non-medication strategies. Was it enough for you, or have you been compelled to seek out any kind of formal treatment, be it psychological or be it medication or lifestyle changes? Have you pursued any of that?
Well, I mean, the main thing is that I did, after about 6 months after I was diagnosed by Jamie, I started thinking, why have I always been ashamed or just not thought about just trying something that might curb some of the anxiety? So the anxiety was still there. I certainly felt a great deal of more freedom, but I still had a lot of anxiety. And then I was very lucky with the first thing that I took happened to work very effectively for me and has continued to do so.
And what was that?
The sertraline. And I know not everyone will have a great time with it again, so I'm also, I was very lucky that, and it was interesting because I was able to kind of measure it, because what happened was, it wasn't long before I started doing a tour in America with Brian Cox, the scientist. And so I started taking sertraline. I haven't realized, no one had warned me that you get a bit of a dip, first of all. So actually you can be, not for everyone, but you can be in a slightly kind of, you might slip into a bit of a slightly darker place. And then I've put this in the book actually, because I wrote an email to Brian and his assistant Steph, and said, I don't really know what I'm writing. I think it was even titled "Boring Email." This is. I mean, that's one way you can check whether you're getting better, is how many of your emails start with "sorry to email you." And if you begin to see a dip in how many times you immediately start with apology. But anyway, so I wrote this email, and I said, just so you know, I'm just going through quite a lot of anxiety at the moment, and it won't get in the way of the tour, I promise, or anything like that, but I just wanted to mention to you. And then it was only when I was writing the book that I realized that wasn't because I was more anxious. It was actually because I was less anxious. I was now able to focus on the anxiety so well. And I was also had the confidence to tell someone that I was experiencing anxiety. And then we go on the tour, and I can watch that. Long car journeys will always be something that will make me a bit anxious. If we're going from, New York to Washington or beyond, and you can go through all those things like, oh my God, what if there's no service stations? What if there's nowhere to go to the loo? What if I need to go to the loo? And there's all of that stuff. That's the very typical banal thing that would have dominated a lot of my life. And I would just watch it getting shorter and shorter. So initially I would do what I normally did, which is if we were leaving at about 10:30, I'd get up at 6 a.m. so that my body was as awake as possible, because I'd think otherwise, what if my body's not properly awake? And then I get in the car and I think, oh my God, my body's woken up now and I need to go to the toilet, but actually we're still in the middle of Washington, there's no, whatever, all that stuff. And I would then go, oh, today I got up at 8. And then I would go, and today I went down to breakfast and I actually ate some food, not fearing that if I ate some food, that would somehow create a knock-on effect of something going on with my digestive system. And I had a coffee. I drank a cup of coffee, not, all of these things. So I would just go, there's less today, there's less today, there's less today. And then eventually I went, oh, I now don't think, because that was the IBS kind of side of things, was one of the very, very dominant parts of my life, which I would even 6 months, I would think, oh my God, I've just realized in 6 months' time we're playing Brisbane. Last time we had to get up at 4 a.m. to get the plane from Brisbane. And what if I would start thinking about that. And now that's not in my life. I don't every time that I get into a station think, oh, I better just, nip to the loo before, just in case. So that, it sounds like such a banal and marginal, but that was a way of measuring actually how much anxiety there was in my life.
Right. Wow. And what do you make? There's a lot of discussion in public about ADHD not merely being a condition or a disorder, but actually a huge strength and an adaptation in some ways. And you can see in your career, the ability to have a racing mind, the ability to speak at length, obviously hugely advantageous. Well, what do you think about this tension between ADHD as a so-called medical condition, as opposed to a strength and adaptation, a variation in the human experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many strengths that come with it, and I would like in the book I wrote. While I was just finishing the book, I had an event I was doing with an excellent author called Sarah Perry, who wrote The Essex Serpent amongst other things, and I'm just there writing the book, and it's 5:15 in the afternoon, and I thought, what time am I doing that gig with Sarah Perry tomorrow? And I look up online, and it turns out I'm not doing it tomorrow. I'm doing it that night at 6:30 in 75 minutes. I don't drive. It's in Chelmsford, which is about 70 miles from where I live. I go through total that meltdown where you're kind of punching yourself in the face, and just the self-hatred is just like again, something that would have been far more regular in my life generally, but that was big enough, even with everything, for me just to go, you, and then I managed to get through to a cab company, and I said, I just need to get there really, really quickly, and I haven't fully read the book because I was going to read it the next morning, and then I arrived there 1 minute after the 6:30, go straight on stage. And we have a totally fluid, with no notes, conversation for 90 minutes. And I use that as an example of those are the two sides. There is this side which causes this crash, this meltdown, this self-hatred, this destruction of yourself that you wish would happen, this desire to just switch yourself off. And yet then within 75 minutes, I was able to appear to be and when I did a thing with Slavoj Žižek the other day, again, the Barbican, and I didn't have to look at any notes. I made some notes, I read some stuff, but then I just started. And I think all of those things are that speed of mind that can come with this. I never use the term superpower in the same way with autism either, because I think that can be very dangerous, because I think there are so many different levels and different experiences, whether you are autistic, ADHD, both, dyspraxic, dyslexia, whatever it might be. And I think it can therefore actually fight against people who really don't feel they have a superpower. And it's almost makes it so. But I do think it can be a different set of abilities, and really brilliant abilities for people. And that's the great thing about being easily bored is, that's why, when I'm with Josie Long, it doesn't matter if we've not seen each other for 6 months. We just start immediately talking. There's no kind of, hey, how are you? It's straight into whatever is bubbling in our head. And then we'll just talk for about 17 hours or whatever. And all of those things. And then when you go into what is considered the more normal world, that is really stultifying. That's another thing I found really useful, which is I don't go to parties very often. The mixture of the background noise and the kind of what I would say is conversations for no point are quite difficult to get hit from in any way. But I will do the pragmatic thing. If someone says, will you come to this party with me? And I'll go, yes, if they're a bit worried about going to the party. And then I'll think, can I, and I'll say, can I go once you're comfortable? They went, no, you have to stay for the whole thing. And now I don't feel any shame once everyone seems happy in the party, I'll just go and stand in the garden on my own. Just drink some wine on my own, look at the stars. And that bit of not following social regulations and not feeling bad about it and not feel like you're breaking any, no, it's fine. I'm just going, I remember someone said, a bunch of people were going, is he all right? He's just standing in the garden. And then one person who knew me reasonably well went, yeah, fine.
What about people who feel like they actually, there's a lot of people with ADHD, they get a diagnosis. They feel like actually they want to become more consistent. They want to become more predictable. And maybe they do have jobs which just require that kind of consistency and predictability. Let's say they're training as a doctor, for instance, or some kind of profession which requires them to be very, very consistent. Is that something, have you had friends who have had to overcome those kinds of struggles, really kind of on some way work on those ADHD traits in order to become more consistent?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. I don't think there's like one single, cultish way that we must now all become this thing. And especially like I would say friends of mine who are, for instance, parents in particular, friends of mine, who I've got one friend who's the mother of 2 small children. And to now have a period of time in the day due to the medication she can take to just have proper focus. Because, of course, as we know, especially for women, that, being a parent, there is so much that is, in terms of what is responsibility, because there still is such an imbalance between, the father and the mother very often. And so I think for her, that has really helped. And I think anyone, again, I don't have a normal job. And I find if I go into an office in the BBC, within 10 minutes, my elbows feel red raw from rubbing against the sides of the room. And, and I'm always just fiddle-faddling around and not really, it looks like I'm not concentrating, but I am taking everything in. It's interesting that I was talking with someone whose daughter is autistic and just at university, and she said that her daughter gets in trouble because when she's at a lecture, she also reads a book. Because if she's only doing one thing, it's not going in at all. And again, that's another, sorry, I'm answering another question, but that thing where you go, I think it's really important for those people who are neurotypical to know that when we're not necessarily being obedient in the way they think, like looking someone in the eye being a typical one, which is for many of us, looking someone in the eye means that we're really concentrating on looking in their eyes, but we're not hearing a word they're saying. So it's an absolute lie whereas, I might be fiddle-faddling around with something else, but actually I'm taking everything in as well. It's just that I'm not following the social. So I definitely think that there is no single correct way. The way that we're looking for is for people to have a greater contentment in their life, is for people to have, less anxiety, less self-hatred. And I know people belittle this stuff all the time and kind of, but there are people living agonized lives, and there are, it's that old line, was it Thoreau? Is it Thoreau? Or I can't remember now, but, people living lives of quiet desperation. And there are so many people living those lives. And when I meet those people who've managed to come out to another destination and found a new way, and I see their happiness as well. I meet people sometimes teenagers who've just been diagnosed or on the way of diagnosis or just understanding. And every single time you meet people who you see the lightness in them now, you see that the weight that has gone. And I don't understand why, every time people go, we don't even want much. It's not as if you go, oh God, these ADHD people, and they all get given special luxury swimming pools or whatever. It's not, it's literally, it's like the vegan thing. I always use the example of people always go, oh, don't vegans bang on a lot? But vegans don't bang on nearly as much as people bang on about vegans banging on. And in the same way, the requirements of people, whether it's ADHD, certainly a lot of autistic people. And, again, today we're recording the day after Robert Kennedy has done the most horrible speech saying autistic people will never write poetry, autistic people will never pay tax. Oh my God. That we should have, not only is he an anti-vaxxer, but he's entirely erasing the, the book is dedicated to Sold, which is a beautiful charity shop in Shoreham by Sea, which is the majority of the people who work there are autistic and autistic or other learning differences. And, I see what's been built there for a lot of people who 20, 30, 40 years ago, they would have just been considered to be nothing, unrequired and placed in the corner. And to give people the fullest life, that's another thing. We need to create a society where people live the fullest lives possible.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I was speaking to an ADHD expert a couple of weeks ago, and the way he phrased it is it's about the gentle balance of acceptance and change, and for helping the individual see which areas are more about acceptance, which areas are more about change. And I think the elegant thing about that is it applies to ADHD, but it really applies to the human experience at large. I think that's a really helpful framework people can use. And when I think about your life, Robin, and your trajectory, it's kind of like you are lucky in the sense that you very early found the career that suited you, that suited that disposition. It seems like, and it might have been in a different life, a different reality, had you become an accountant, say, and then gotten diagnosed with ADHD at the same age. It's not just the acceptance piece, but actually the change piece of let me find some work that actually suits my disposition, perhaps, or figure out a way to be a better accountant.
If I hadn't come from the privileged background, the nice middle-class background I come from, my friends who work in prisons, the number of people who are ADHD in prisons, people who have not had, they have not had any come from backgrounds with no support within their existence, and at the same time, these minds that can be so erratic, and and that's a vast, problem. The number of people who are neurodivergent, or indeed, mental health issues, and who then will just live their life in a perpetual cycle of incarceration.
let's address the elephant in the room. And I actually would like, again, Anya's take on this. The overdiagnosis. Is ADHD being overdiagnosed? There's a lot of, ADHD, for like it or not, there is a lot of controversy. There is a lot of public debate amongst professionals and non-professionals. We were talking offline about Suzanne O'Sullivan's new book, Age of Diagnosis. We have actually spoken to Suzanne on the podcast before about her previous book about psychosomatic illness. I'm going to put my cards out on the table. I think there could be a problem with both overdiagnosis of ADHD in some respects and underdiagnosis for different reasons. What do you think, Anya? What's your perspective on this?
It was actually a question I was going to put to both you and Robin. So I'm really pleased about the fact that I now have to express an opinion. But no, I mean, I guess what I will probably err on the side of not expressing an uninformed opinion, because I think that's probably less helpful than anything else. But it's certainly something that, to follow from what you've said, Alex, I guess the worry that I have is the size of the waiting lists for NHS diagnoses, which I think contributes to the possibility of underdiagnosis in people who, as you say, Robin, aren't from nice middle-class backgrounds. And if we assume that it is a condition that we're getting better at recognizing, or sort of a way of being that we're getting better at recognizing, chances are there'll be the same socioeconomic disparities as there are sort of in most of health. And given the problems that arise for people who are ADHD without knowing it, like you say, Robin, the sort of the prison rates, the drug use, I think, is so much higher. That's an issue. And then on the back of that is the idea, if the overdiagnosis, I really don't know what the situation is there. And I think the problem we have is that some professionals diagnose in a nuanced, thoughtful way where they really try to think through the whole person's life. They get collateral information from friends, family. They sort of try to get an understanding of the person's development from childhood. And I don't think that's what every clinic does, and that's not what every clinician does. And that potentially is problematic because it's based on questions, because it's based on clinical experience, it creates the potential for people to be incorrectly diagnosed, and either for something to be missed or for them to be receiving sort of an incorrect explanation for their difficulties, and then from there potentially be experiencing harms from the treatments that come on. But I'd really like to hear both of your views, as you, Alex, kind of in the clinic that you work in, the experience, and Robin from talking to people that you have in writing this book.
Well, that answer, I suppose, Anya, really what we're saying there is society is tremendously imbalanced, and there's something hugely wrong in having a country that is as rich as ours, where we have such an imbalance between the richest and the poorest in terms of accessibility of so many things. I'm sure you've seen those awful statistics where I think it used to be, I don't know if it is still now, but there used to be a road that ran across Kentish Town. And if you were on one side of that road, you would die, I think on average, something like 9 years earlier than if you were on the other side of that road. And that was that way of actually measuring the difference. In the other side of the road was all council flats and for people, sheltered housing. And so I think that's the biggest issue I would like to challenge, that I think is on so many things, on education, the problems we have at school, the problems we have where class size means that if a kid is ADHD, already it's a huge issue when you've got a class size of 30 people there. I was talking to a young mother whose daughter, it's extremely unlikely that her teenage daughter, early teens, is not autistic in all the ways, but in fact she is autistic. She's been diagnosed, but the local council said I think she should just go to this normal secondary school. And her mother's saying, well, she's actually, her where she is on the spectrum is, she will just wander off. If you put her in a huge school, she wanders all the time. All this stuff, and so you're always seeing this cutting, everything has to be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which shows that we're living in a society that has no respect for life, for the equality of everyone and everyone to have access to these things. I mean, the waiting list for audio, again, another person that I met who's got a daughter who's not quite a teenager yet, but has been told 4 years before her daughter will get diagnosed. Now, going through puberty for 4 years and being autistic, undiagnosed autistic, that's a huge issue to me. So, in the end, I almost writing this book is my journey towards something between, Marxism and anarchy in terms of my anger about, and also then on the other side, like Suzanne O'Sullivan's book on the ADHD side, I found it very unhelpful when she said things like, she said anecdotally, at one point, she says only anecdotally, but I am worried that people who are diagnosed with ADHD, that there is no palpable improvement in their life. And then continues by saying many of them say that they're happier. Now, first of all, I think, well, that is a palpable improvement. Happiness in your life is, and then continues to say, there's another, but despite that, many of them are leaving education or leaving their jobs, as if that's a negative thing. Now, there may be many, again, the reason that they have squeezed themselves into a shape to fit, however much that contortion has been painful, if they are now given the freedom to remove some of those shackles to get out from that box, we shouldn't just go, oh, they left their jobs, that must be a negative thing. It could be one of the most positive things that's ever happened. I'm sure we will all have friends who have jobs they absolutely loathe, but sometimes remain in them out of a mixture of fear and at least you have a certainty if you always hate your job. So yeah, I think what we see with so many of these issues, not just in terms of neurodivergence, mental, it is that it's always about saving money. And if someone is, and what right do we have to choose the correct level of despair that someone is concealing before they're allowed to? I mean, it's like when I talk to people I was chatting to someone who's gone through periods of really vicious suicidal thoughts, and when they started, when another cycle of them started, and they have attempted to take their own life in the past, so I should have probably prefaced this with hopefully people know, but they said the most ridiculous thing is that they were told, unfortunately, we can't do anything until you've actually tried to take your own life. And it seems to me that a lot of issues we are not handling them until they have got to a point of utter desperation. And that is also very costly for society, the cost of all of these things. So, yeah, so my answer is one from a anarchist Marxist perspective.
I think I definitely agree with you on the point of the way emergency mental health services are set up is incredibly problematic in that way that, for example, we have these really harsh risk thresholds and sometimes people are turned away because they're not risky enough, because they, for example, haven't attempted self-harm or to take their own lives even, and in some respects. And that, of course, if someone wants help or have some help from mental health services, that will logically incentivize the exact behavior you want to avoid. That's a huge problem. But I don't think the kind of inequality and discrimination is the only issue when it comes to ADHD and autism. I want to speak just about ADHD because I don't feel like I have enough expertise to comment on autism. There are some real problems about the diagnosis. I think I'm just going to mention three. One is, I think our diagnostic criteria aren't sophisticated enough and they haven't been updated in a long time. Unfortunately, again, I don't feel like I have quite enough expertise to say how they should be updated, but I think there's generally a sense that in the ADHD community that they're worth revisiting.
On the first problem, that because I suppose we started off by almost framing this whether there's too much diagnosis. Not so much the idea is there an issue with the diagnosis and the criteria, because I would certainly say, I just wanted to throw, that thing about this, still because it's seen as a childhood issue. And, when someone said, can we get when I went for the official one, something written by someone who knew you when you were a child. Well, pretty much everyone who knew me well enough to in any way observe me from a distance is dead now. So, that wasn't. And secondly, I think it's a really difficult thing to do because so many people are also masking so much when they're a child, when they're staying in a corner of the library or wherever it might be, where they're hiding away. So I feel I was just interested in the diagnostic thing. I can certainly, from my experience, I found the official version of it quite a problematic series of hoops.
I'm really curious. How did you find the assessment, and what was difficult about it?
I think it's also because you are so overly observant of the world you're in. You become tremendously. It was a bit like when I tried therapy. I was so aware of myself, so fearful of going, oh, what does that mean? What do I think that means? What do I think that means? What do I think that means? What do you think that I kind of, it was probably one of the most anxious times I had since I had dealt with my anxiety. And I also think it can be quite hard to truly speak honestly in certainly in the environment that I was in. You sat next to someone, probably dressed in a suit or whatever with their pen and their pads. I mean, that's just the experience I had, and they were perfectly fine and everything. But there was, it was one of the least comfortable experiences I've had in the last 3 years in terms of post understanding myself more.
Yes. I often find that people are a bit apprehensive for these assessments. And one of the first things I do is try and de-escalate that anxiety and kind of make it a little bit more comfortable. But I'm just going to talk about these other couple of problems and we can discuss them. So the second problem is which is one Suzanne raises, which is the lack of biomarkers. This is really a problem when it comes to every mental health condition. We don't yet have reliable sort of biological markers we can use. Okay, here's the ADHD. We've done a brain scan. It'd be really useful to have that. And it does raise questions kind of about the scientific validity of the diagnosis, even if clinically it's a pattern that you see over and over again, which I think, you do. And that's why I think ADHD diagnosis and treatment can still be useful. The lack of biomarkers is a problem. And then the third problem I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is this is a problem I actually deal with quite a lot in the clinic, is that we treat ADHD officially as you either have ADHD or not, unlike autism, where it's acknowledged that it's a spectrum. In reality, ADHD is almost certainly a spectrum because there isn't one ADHD gene. It's very likely actually there are a ton of different genes, which would mean it's a trait not like eye color, where you have like either brown eyes or blue eyes. It's probably a lot more like height. You're 168 and then 169 and then 170. In the clinic, this is a huge problem because very often you'll see someone and you say, this is either, officially, mild ADHD or maybe what you would call sub-threshold ADHD, where they have traits, but you wouldn't necessarily say they warrant the full diagnosis. And then you get into really interesting territory philosophically. And it also helps sort of underscore, again, back to my first point, that there's problems with the diagnostic criteria. I think where the usefulness of the diagnosis really shines is where there's a really severe case, where they're extremely restless, have all of the cardinal signs, then, no problem with the diagnosis there. But for all those gray area cases and cases where other factors may be at play, like metabolic problems, other mental health problems like depression, things like that, then it can get pretty tricky.
What do you think, Anya, in terms of what Alex just said?
I think the idea of a spectrum in some ways would be more helpful to work with clinically. I don't know if it would be more helpful to people because that feels like it's much more reflective of the reality of our world and psychiatric illnesses in general. We had Ave Safdab on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he talked about the philosophical approach to diagnosis and the idea that there are some things that you either have or you don't have, like say an infection of some kind. You say you either have syphilis or you don't have syphilis. You can isolate the bug or you can't. But there are other things where there has been a much more kind of human application of knowledge and culture and science to give a diagnosis or not. And that very much applies to most of psychiatry, but also to things like diabetes, for instance. We sort of set a number on a blood test, after which, and so there is a biomarker, but we still apply we still say, okay, here you have diabetes, here you don't. And then a few years later we say, oh, do you know what? Pre-diabetes actually is quite important and does actually seem to be associated with some problems as well. And that's, that's fine. That's knowledge. That's us improving our understanding of the world. But I guess it feels a little bit like that. Maybe that's where we're at a little bit with a lot of mental illness and perhaps with conditions like ADHD, in that right now we're sort of saying, yes, you have it, yes, you don't. And then we have lots of arguments because we're saying, this doctor thought you had it and this doctor thought you didn't. Whereas perhaps maybe that's not the most useful question. And the more useful question is, all right, so what are the problems that you're getting? What are the treatments that we can offer? What's the risk of those treatments? What's the potential benefits that they can offer? And if you, as the sort of competent adult, are happy to accept the potential risks and you try it and it gives you benefits, then sort of go ahead. And I guess, like you were saying, Robin, if we're talking about improving people's quality of lives, that feels like a slightly more useful way, to acknowledge that it probably is a spectrum rather than a blanket. Not a blanket, that's not the right word. A binary, yes or no.
I think that's it, because I've got an old book from the 1950s, one of those kind of half Freudian, half existential psychotherapy books, and it's called The Everyday Problems of Living. And I think that the thing is that when we don't have the language, especially to describe what is actually going on in our mind, then we can't, the reason we need to understand these things more is because, as we know with language, it can change our sensory experience of the world. Because, and in the same way, that bit, if someone says, if we're not able to truly, and it's very hard, of course, to actually express your feelings unless they get to the extreme of, in terms of, suicidal thoughts, etc. So I think that's one of the things, is we need more open discussion just about how we are feeling, and how, when someone came up to me, I think I mentioned in the book, I was doing a show in Sydney, and a woman came up to me, she went, I think I'm ADHD. And she went, I was wondering about getting a diagnosis. And I said, how is your life? She went, brilliant. I have a really great time. I said, well, honestly, if you are happy, I don't necessarily know whether you need a diagnosis. If you are not finding challenges in you, then I don't think, I said, but to now at least be aware that there may be times that when you do go, why do I feel like this? Why do I feel that might be a way to then just investigate a little bit more about ADHD, and whether, so I think it's, actually knowing what are the problems. It's not just your ADHD, it's actually the way that you're living. It's the pain that and as we know with pain itself, physical pain, the difference in terms of physical pain. There's that great, I think I wrote about in the science, but the importance of being interested, the great story from the Lancet of the builder who a nail gun went right through his foot. The nail, and he was in absolute agony, and they had to give him the highest doses of morphine. He was screaming, and when it got to the X-ray, it turned out the nail had actually missed his foot. It was just between two toes, not even in the toe. There was no damage at all. But his belief of that pain, and I think things like that, again, in terms of being able to understand the emotional pain people might go through, we are lacking the language required, and especially because people are still ashamed of these things, and there is still so much. I know imposter syndrome isn't really a syndrome, so we put the imposter sensation of, should I really be making this fuss? Isn't everything all right? Oh, I should just keep quiet, and just not having the vocabulary required. And I think the more vocabulary people have, and the more, and it's that bit of speaking out aloud as well. Like, there was someone I know who sent me a thing about some pretty awful abuse that she experienced when she was younger. And she said, oh, I'm sorry to make this so heavy. And I said, I want to live in a world where we don't have to call that heavy, that we just say these are acceptable conversations when we are friends, and we don't have to immediately go into a special way of talking. This is life for so many people. If we are able to actually talk about the intricacies of life, apart from anything else, we end up having far more in terms of educational and in terms of feeding in the most pragmatic way our curiosity of understanding each other. And I think that's such an important thing, that the more that we talk about our inner life. Because I definitely have found that, because there are little bits in my shows where I sometimes talk about these things in whatever ridiculous gesture-ish way, but I will get the number of times that people come up to me and go, oh my God, I didn't realise. I didn't, because I have that. And it's that bit when we speak out aloud, we are able to build the stories not merely for ourselves, but for other people to express their own as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, articulation of our difficulties, of course, is such like a tonic. And I think echoing Anya's point, maybe psychiatry starts needing to move in a less objective and a more pragmatic direction. I'm talking about maybe formulating new ways to describe problems rather than rely on diagnoses. Like, if someone came to the clinic with ADHD-like problems, whether or not they have a thing that we could call ADHD, their problems are much more self-evident. Like they have problems concentrating. They have problems with timekeeping or organization or restlessness. Those problems are self-evident and there doesn't need to be any public debate about them. And then the conversation can shift to, okay, what's the landscape of options? What's the menu of options, of which there are tons and tons. That's the really good thing about ADHD. Tons of things actually that you can do to help to address some of those difficulties. So perhaps more broadly, that's the kind of the direction the mental health system needs to think about moving in, perhaps.
Yeah, I think. Anya, what do you think?
It sounds good in many ways. I think the issue is that and we've come sort of full circle, but it becomes like a societal problem because I think I remember in my first couple of years of training, even now, I sort of love writing my kind of paragraph page long impression of a formulation of, these are sort of all the factors and this is the story, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, when you are, when you're looking at the person's record or sort of their GP's communicating with you or their lawyers communicating with you or whatever it might be, what they want is a sort of 3-word diagnosis. And they're a helpful shorthand to some extent as well. They can help us kind of point in the direction of treatments, etc. But so I don't know that that's a problem for psychiatry to solve, or maybe in some way, I don't know, perhaps psychiatry could lead the way. But I think we'll just be shouting in our own little rooms, I think, if psychiatrists try to fix it, because actually it needs to be much more than that. And I think often even, patients, or you give them the explanation of, here's the paragraph explanation in words, and they're like, yeah, but are you diagnosing me with anything? And I presume I think that's just because that's how people have been brought up to see their health. I imagine, right? I don't know.
I think that's interesting because it makes me think in terms of, I think one of the things that I've been learning with the more science shows that I've done over the last 20 years, which is, the important thing is not necessarily the answer, it's the questions it can then generate. And I think we live in a kind of society, though, which says a lot of the time, but just tell me what the answer is. And that's actually not the most useful thing. The most useful thing is, for instance, when Jamie spoke to me and took me through all these different ADHD things, the interesting thing for me was what it then generated. It wasn't interesting to me. In fact, it was rather worrying to me and rather embarrassing in a certain way. I thought, everyone will just think I'm a bit of an idiot and everyone's saying this nowadays, whatever. But it generated lots of questions about, hang on a minute, so why do I do this? And why does that happen? And why have we just had that exchange? And why am I looking at that? For, that to me is I think if we look at things going, here is the solution, as opposed to the solution is now the start of where else. And again, that's not what I think the system wants. The system wants to go, you are this, here is a prescription, please leave.
So the solution is encouraging more deeper reflection, self-examination, and then potentially, how could I start to think about getting more harmony in my life, actually more harmony between my internal and external state, something like that?
I think also lowering shame. I think that's within that answer you just said, which is there are so many things in this, and so much of our world is built around, you look at the way the news media and social media work, and so much of it is about shaming people. whether it's in this most simplistic way, the body shaming of famous women or whatever, but also psychological shaming, that all of those different things, which it reminds me of when I was doing that thing with Slavoj Žižek. He has this way of summing up a certain way of, I think it's Balkan thinking, where he says, this is the way you need to think about the way of Balkan thinks. And this is, he says, if a fairy suddenly arrived at the farmer and said, I will give you anything you want, but just so you know, I will give twice as much to the farmer who lives next door to you, whatever you request. And the farmer says, take one of my eyes. And he says and I think a lot of our thinking is that we look not at what, not in the positive way. We look at, oh, good, someone else has had something worse than me. Good. And I think, again, it's about, a lot of this is about a positive outlook, is about, one of the things that I find really interesting about hanging around generally with, in groups of neurodivergent people. I don't know if you've come across this either, but I notice there is a very low amount of banter. There is a lot of mucking around. There is a lot of joking. There is a lot of talking in the most fabulous, ridiculous manner sometimes. So many different things, but there is not the competition to be the winner and make sure someone else is the loser in a conversation. And that might not be true in for other people's experience, but certainly my experience, and a lot of people I spoke to said, yeah, it's like you feel that you're united and let's have a really great time. And in the same way, I think I was thinking about this the other day. I was doing a gig at Amnesty International, and one of the acts wonderful act called Cheeky Keita, she said, "Do you still get nervous before you go on stage?" I said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I go out there and I think everyone wants to have a nice time. And if you go out and the starting point is love, you might have that rejected, and I thought." That seems to be so very often if you go to a comedy club, the comic will walk on stage and immediately be antagonistic, which means they themselves feel threatened. So they're now threatening the front row or whatever. And I realized, well, actually, that's a lot of everyone's existence. Do you leave your front door hoping in some ways that there will be love and beauty or something on the way? Or do you leave your front door immediately waiting for the first antagonism? Which, of course, also would have been my existence for a long period of time. And if you are able not to immediately go out with this negative and defensive frame of mind, I think there is such a possibility of growth. And I know it can be very difficult because I know people do not live easy lives, and I do understand that. But I also think there are other people where you think, some of those people like Lawrence Fox or whatever, you think, oh, my God, stop whining. You've got every possibility, and you're rich and you're a white guy and all of those things. And all you're doing is, well, actually, I think I've had a worse time than everyone else. And that does seem to me, I mean, it's the Trump way, isn't it? Trump is always saying, no one's had it as hard as me as being president. And then they go on about the woke, always whining. And you think, oh my God, have you ever heard how much you whine the whole time?
There's an interesting psychological idea behind this, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, but it's called Karpman's drama triangle. And it's essentially the idea that in dysfunctional situations, people tend to occupy very specific roles. And it's usually victim, persecutor, rescuer. Victim is obviously the victim who usually disowns their power. The persecutor arguably takes on too much power and persecutes. The rescuer self-sacrifices usually to help the victim. And people often go into victim mode as a pretense to then allow them to persecute. So if you look at Hitler in the 1930s, he basically went on a campaign of claiming different ways Germany was victimized, each instance using that as an opportunity for Germany to gain territory. So we were victimized, therefore we have to go into Czechoslovakia. We were victimized, and therefore we have to expand our territory further, until eventually Poland was just the last straw, actually, in a long series of territorial expansions. And you see this all the time. Obviously, in modern politics, you need an enemy to fight against, so you need to kind of go into victimhood first. And I think the same thing plays out culturally with mental health. A label, like a diagnostic label, allows the possibility of othering. It allows the possibility of prejudice. It allows the ability to project your hatreds or your fears or insecurities into another group. So all of these things make the diagnostic process even more complicated.
I was going to say, again, at the beginning of the week that we're recording this, there was the finding on the definition of biological sex, and some of the pieces that have been written, you would believe that, oh my God, yeah, that Britain has been under this heavy yoke of trans regulations, when in fact people with an enormous amount of power have, been fighting against really a group of people with far less power and far less representation, and the way that it is framed, though, as if to say, oh yeah, it's just gone too far now, hasn't it? The way, and you go, it hasn't really got anywhere. Yeah, and now we've taken a huge step backwards, and I find the fact that we fall into those traps of believe, it's like, again, how the bullies manage to also be the victims. We see that in politics all the time. The people with the most power say, "Poor me," and I think it. And we're seeing, looking in America at the moment, and it will catch on in the UK, and is catching on in the UK, to see the oppression that is going on for anything that can be described as diversity, which literally means anything that might have been done that was notable by someone who wasn't an old white guy. I mean, it is a white supremacist, nation at the moment. And I find, and again, whether in the same way when we look at mental health, when we look at the life of the mind, in any way of othering people, we have a real battle now against, because it's it's a bit like for years now, almost since I was a child, there have been articles written and columnists who always say, well, of course, nowadays the worst thing to possibly be is a middle class white man, because the best thing to be is a one-legged black lesbian, right? And I have looked at society, and there is still, and has not been in the last 35 years, a one-legged black lesbian in charge of the Bank of England, in charge of the BBC, as this false thing, which is the moment there is even the slightest threat of someone having the same opportunity as you, we will then instead decide, well, all women are now in charge of this, or all trans people are in charge of that, or the whole thing's gone LGBT crazy, or, oh God, you can't get Star Wars now. You can't appear in Star Wars unless you're a black actor or a woman. Well, apart from all those white guys in it. Yeah. I mean, apart from them, I do think one of the most positive things that is coming out of the oppression that is building up is I just see more and more wonderful, beautiful voices. And one of the things that we need to do as human beings is, there's a great line, oh God, I've forgotten her name now, wonderful writer who said that we spend too much time looking for poison and not enough time finding nourishment, so that we can constantly keep focusing on the negative voices. And what we should do is go, that negative voice means that I now need to elevate this positive voice instead. In fact, I'm going to entirely ignore the existence of that negative voice, and instead I'm going to raise the platform for this voice that speaks against them and speaks with, love. And so much of my favorite recently, a lot of the art that I've been to, I just love the fact that when you see things and you just go, this starts from love. There's a wonderful exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in London, a woman called Michelena Thomas. And right at the beginning, it just talks about that it comes from love. And with that love is also a great amount of activism as well. But if our activism and if our desires to make a better world for, whether it's neurodivergent people, whether we're talking about, race, sexuality, gender, whatever it might be, if all of these things start from love, then we are already, the seeds that we're able to sow are so much more powerful than those who are starting with derision and hate.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a good starting point. Robin, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Your new book, Normally Weird and Weirdly Normal, My Adventures in Neurodiversity, it's going to be out May 1st. If my plans and machinations work out correctly, this episode will be out May 2nd. We'll put a link in the description. Robin, where can people go to find out more about your work?
If they just go to robinince.com, I'm doing about 100 gigs in the next 60 days. Libraries and bookshops, independent bookshops, and I will then be doing even more after that. So they can find out all about the book, and if they're and I hopefully, if I'm not coming to somewhere near them and they'd like me to, just get in contact, because I'll find a way of coming, because I've put in 100 dates, but I've still got a huge amount of the UK that I've not put in yet, but I will be.
Perfect. Robin, Anya, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.